Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Alia Marrero Alatar. I'm a junior here at the college studying government and history and literature, and the director of outreach for the JFK Junior Forum Committee. Before we begin, please take a moment now to note the exit doors located both on the Park side and the JFK Street side. In the case of an emergency, we will congregate in JFK Park. Please take a moment now to also silence your cell phones. And now join me in welcoming Harvard College undergraduate Zahra Rouhani-Nejad.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Zahra Rouhani-Nejad, and I'm a first year at the college studying social studies and economics. I'm also a member of the JFK Junior Forum Committee. Today, I'm honored and privileged to introduce our speaker, Morgan Ortagus. Ortagus is a key national security expert and was the former deputy to the U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East and Special Envoy to Lebanon under Steve Witkoff for the Trump administration. Ms. Ortagus began her diplomatic career in 2007, where she was temporarily assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. She then became an intelligence analyst, and starting in 2010, Ortagus served as the Deputy U.S. Treasury Attaché and the principal liaison from the U.S. Treasury to the banking sector and financial intelligence unit in Saudi Arabia. She went on to become a national security contributor at Fox News before being appointed spokesperson for the U.S. Department of State. In her role, she worked closely with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to promote and support the Abraham Accords. After leaving her position as Deputy U.S. Special Envoy in June of last year, Ortagus currently serves as Senior Policy Advisor in the U.S. mission to the United Nations, where she works on U.S. diplomacy and international policy. Speaking with Ortagus today, we will be having two moderators. Our first moderator is Ned Price, who is the Deputy to the U.S. Representative to the United Nations from 2024 to 2025. Previous to that, he was spokesperson for the U.S. Department of State. And now he's part of our community as our interim co-director for the Institute of Politics. Our second moderator is Bahar Moradi. A junior at the college, Moradi is pursuing a joint concentration in social studies and Middle Eastern studies with a secondary in computer science. She's the former co-chair of the JFK Junior Forum Committee and is currently serving as president of the Harvard College Iranian Association and co-chair of the Harvard Iranian Gala Steering Committee. Now, please give a round of applause to our guests and moderators for tonight. Thank you.
Well, I want to start by thanking our audience for braving the elements to be here tonight. It's good on all of you for being here despite the gorgeous weather outside. I especially want to thank our guest, Morgan, for being here. This is Morgan's first public appearance since leaving the Trump administration just a couple weeks ago. We are grateful that she chose Harvard to be her first stop. And I'd be remiss not to add, and I don't want to get either of us in trouble here, Morgan, but you and I, we've known each other for some time. You were my predecessor at the State Department. And again, I don't want to get you in trouble, but you were always very helpful when I was in the job. We always kept an open line of communication, and I'm really grateful that dialogue and communication and that back and forth will continue tonight. Bahar.
Yes, and before we begin, we just want to take a moment to ground everyone in the context of what has unfolded prior to the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran on February 28th. So in late December, the Iranian rial collapsed to $1.42 million against the dollar, a 56% drop in just 6 months. Merchants and shopkeepers closed their doors and took to the streets. Within days, protests had spread to over 100 cities and transformed into the largest anti-regime uprising inside Iran since the 1979 revolution. In early January, President Trump made repeated public promises to the Iranian people, warning the regime against killing protesters and telling Iranians that help was on the way. On January 8th, the 12th day of protests, the regime responded by shutting down the internet of the country's 92 million people, which marks the most severe digital blackout in Iran's history. What happened under that darkness is still being pieced together. Videos have surfaced of military-grade weapons used by the regime's military forces against peaceful protesters, resulting in mountains of body bags, families forced to pay just to receive the bodies of their loved ones, and specifically women, whose bodies have been withheld and subjected to repulsive, unspeakable violations. In early February, the US and Iran entered nuclear negotiations in Oman. After 3 rounds of talks that failed to produce a breakthrough, the US and Israel launched strikes on Iran. Politics is clearly inevitably embedded in our discussion today, but we ask that humanity remain at the center. The right path forward is ambiguous and something that we will not reach today, but what we hope is that everyone in this room approaches today's conversation first and foremost with empathy. So, with that being said, Ms. Ortagus, the administration justified these strikes by citing an imminent threat to the US and its allies. Can you help us understand the specific nature of that threat and why it was America's responsibility to act now?
Of course. First, let me start by thanking all of you for coming. I appreciate it. I know how much everyone at Harvard loves the Trump administration, so I see that's why we have a full room. But thank you to Ned. I have had a lot of people reach out, ask me to speak, and I said, no, I need a break. And then I look at the text message from Ned, and I thought, I can't say no to this. There's a camaraderie that you share when you're at the State Department podium. It is, I don't know if you remember this, but he came into what was my office. I was bequeathing it to him between the 2 administrations, and I wrote on the wall, welcome to the best job in Washington. And the State Department spokesperson, and Jen Psaki was before me and helped me transition, really is a dream job. It's the ability to be the face of American foreign policy to the world. And I remember at times, Ned, people would be critical, like, why did he say that? And it's sort of like when people criticize the quarterback of the pro team, it's like you would last 2 seconds at that podium. So we have a deep camaraderie from everybody who have been at that podium, no matter the administration. So I'm grateful to be here. It's important for me to say that I am no longer in the Trump administration, so these are my opinions as much as I can have an opinion. But the urgency question, or the immediate question is an interesting one, because I look at as 47, almost 50 years of a regime that has been terrorizing the United States, that has been killing our men and women in uniform, that has been threatening and harassing our allies and friends. And of course, people tend to forget that just in the past few years, Iran has been openly engaging in what are acts of war against the United States. As Ned well knows, during the Biden administration, the Iranian regime did something unprecedented, which is they were plotting to kill and assassinate on American soil both former and current administration officials. One of them, of course, was my former boss, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and my other colleagues. So that happened during the Biden administration, and we know, of course, they were actively plotting to assassinate President Trump during the campaign. And without getting into specifics, those continued during the first year of the Trump administration, and those are, of course, acts of war. And just because the Iranians were poor at their job and didn't succeed doesn't make it any less of an act of war. So I could go through, the list of things that this evil regime has perpetrated, mostly against their own people. But when you look specifically at the last 47, 50 years, you can give example after example of how they have harassed and threatened and just been the cause of tumult and chaos in the region. If you look at every country that has had to endure the Iranian regime and their negative influence, look at Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, you look at failed state after failed state after failed state. And where you see a country that has a government within a government because of the terror organizations that Iran has funded, their proxies, all they do is seek to overturn the legitimacy of those governments. So they've been a threat to the United States. They've plotted and have been successful in some cases at killing our men and women. And of course, they've been a threat to their own people, a threat to the region. Really crucially, in just the last 6 months, from what we understand, what the president has said publicly, he has declassified this information by way of saying it himself. The president has talked about the threat. Steve Witkoff has talked about how the Iranians openly bragged about the enriched uranium that they were compiling. most importantly, people forget that the ballistic missile and what we call the conventional weapons threat from the regime towards American bases and towards our friends and allies in the region was growing more and more prolific. Some public estimates are that it was 100 ballistic missiles a month. And so at some point, you have to put diplomacy first, but at some point you also have to call the question. I can tell you in the first half of last year, before the 12-day war, I was very involved with Steve Witkoff as his deputy and working with him and preparing him on the negotiations. And I can tell you, I know some people don't believe me when I say this, but I can tell you, being in the room and being there, President Trump very much wanted a deal with the regime and was willing to give them one. And even this time, I think that he understood that the regime was just trying to string along, as they have any and every negotiation. I mean, listen, I think that there was a very good faith effort in the Biden administration, as Ned can speak to try and get the Iranians to the deal. So the Iranians and both the Republican and Democratic administrations, and we took very different tacks. We probably don't need to relitigate the JCPOA for the millionth time. We may have taken very different approaches, but both Republican and Democrat administrations extended the hand of diplomacy to Iran, only for the regime to shove it back in our faces constantly. So I think it's not one single threat, it's a culmination of threats. And of course, the President and Secretary Rubio have said within the past week that they felt they were days away from the Iranians preemptively attacking the United States, which led to them to make the decision that it was time to go.
So Morgan, can I press you on 2 points there? You've talked about the why and the articulated rationales for why, and you've gone through a number of them. The one that we seem to hear most frequently from the administration is the nuclear threat. The same nuclear threat that 9 months ago was totally obliterated. Yeah. That we heard over and over again from the president, and whenever anyone dare say otherwise, that person would find themselves, outside of the administration or the subject of some attack. And within the past couple of days, people like Steve Witkoff have now been saying they were days, hours away from having enough enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon. So help us understand that. And then the why aside, I'm curious if you could speak to the how the administration went about this. As someone watching this from my chair, I almost long for the days of George W. Bush, when we had an administration that spent months articulating a case for war, agree with it or not, in a highly public forum. Whereas in this case, the president gave a State of the Union just 10 or so days ago, spent, I think, 3 minutes on Iran, certainly didn't prepare the country for the prospect of a looming war, certainly didn't prepare the Congress, and yet here we find ourselves. So I'm wondering if you could help us understand those 2 points.
I think the president, when he talked about obliterating the Iranian nuclear program, I think it was specific to the sites that we struck, which have been, at least from the public estimates, rendered inoperable. But clearly, and I think this is, if you know the regime, when I was Treasury Attaché in Saudi, I once had a Saudi official that said to me, I was there lobbying for, at that time, that was first term Obama. And we were lobbying for sanctions against the regime, and they said, fine, we'll go along with it. But they said to me, the Iranians will eat grass if they have to in order to get a nuclear weapon. They didn't believe at the time that the sanctions would be effective. So it's not a surprise to me that the regime spent their time after the 12-day war reconstituting their ability to try and get to a nuclear weapon. It's not a surprise to me because that's been their modus operandi for decades. And every government, no matter where you are in the world, has to make trade-off decisions. You make a trade-off decision. Are you going to spend X amount on your budget for defense, or are you going to spend it for public health? Are you going to spend it for infrastructure, for roads, and these sorts of things? And the Iranian regime has consistently put the needs of Hezbollah and Hamas and the PMF in Iraq and ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons production over the needs of their own people. You see that not only in the choices that they make from a budget perspective, but you see it in the massacring of innocent Iranian civilians, which we unfortunately saw over the past few months, but it's nothing new, right? We've been seeing this going back to the Green Revolution. We've been seeing this as long as this terroristic regime has been in power, we have to always remember that their principal threat is to the beautiful Persian people of Iran who do not deserve to live under tyranny. And I think some of the bravest people in the world that I've encountered are these young women in Tehran that will stand up for the right to simply show their hair and to be heard and to be accounted for. So sorry, I'm going on a tangent. I'm using my time. But so I would say, so in the second part of your case is, I think the second part of your question was, you didn't feel like the Trump administration has made enough of a case. I would say, again, not speaking for them, I would say that if you talk to the Secretary of Defense or State or even the President or the Vice President, I think that they would say that their objectives are very different than the Iraq War, and that there is no intention by this administration to have a prolonged multi-year campaign like we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I think the president sees this as removing a threat, especially the threat from the Iranian Navy, from ballistic missiles. And the president very much, I think, has spoken out on behalf of the Iranian people, and he told them help is on the way. And so when you say that, you have to put money, your money where your mouth is, and I think in this case the president's done so.
Well, let me just follow up. You say the administration has no intention of seeing a prolonged conflict. I've been reminded of the Rumsfeld quote early on in the Iraq War, saying, maybe 6 weeks, certainly not 6 months, and that was in 2003. Yeah. But I actually want to follow up to what you just said about the protests in January. And January seems like an eternity ago, but you were still in government at the time, and could not agree more with what you said about the bravery of the Iranian people, especially Iranian women, who have consistently taken to the streets. And just as you recounted, President Trump did say, encouraged them on, said help is on the way. So help us understand the thinking behind that, because in retrospect, help was not immediate. Those protesters, and there have been various estimates out there, but some estimates, tens of thousands were slaughtered. And there's no bringing them back. And so help us understand why the president said that then, if the plan was not to intervene and bring that help until after the slaughter had stopped.
Yeah, I think I think the president was right on message, and I think it was important. He has been consistent, and not just in this administration, and Trump 1 as well, of supporting the Iranian people. In fact, when I was spokesperson, one of our major initiatives was to figure out in a very close society how we message to the Iranian people, how we have them hear their voice. Now this is, a little bit dated, but even back in 2020 and fall of 2019 is when we had a lot of protests in Iran, and more were slaughtered then. Not as many as now. I think our estimates at the time were a couple thousand. If I remember my numbers correctly, but we opened Telegram channels. One of my initiatives as spokesperson was to spend every day to find a way. Could I do Iran International? Could I do YouTube? Like, what could I do as a way to make sure that we were messaging to the Iranian people the support for the administration? So I think the president's words were incredibly important. And in my belief, no one's been a greater friend as an American president to the Iranian people than President Trump, because he finally stood up to this regime. And not just in this administration. I was there in the early days of January 2020 when he made the decision to take out Qasem Soleimani, who at the time was the world's largest terrorist. And then, of course, has made the kinetic decisions twice in this administration. So when and how you jump in militarily, I guess what I would say, Ned, is there's different ways to support the protesters. It doesn't always have to be kinetic action. And there are things that I'm sure will come out in the media in the coming months and years where you will see that the Trump administration was incredibly supportive of the Iranian people after the president, before the president said those words, when he said them, and afterwards. And that's stuff that will eventually come out. But then, of course, the most obvious way that you could be supportive is through kinetic action. And I think it's incumbent upon the president and the Secretary of Defense to do two things. Number one, your responsibility as cabinet members and as the president of the United States is to protect the American people. And we have a lot of American embassies. We have a lot of U.S. bases in the Middle East. We have a lot of troops there. And so you can't take kinetic action without doing everything that you can to make sure that our assets, everybody now has become an armchair quarterback watching U.S. aircraft carriers and their ships enter the region. I think we have the president has confirmed that we have the third on the way. So you have to get those assets in place, and you have to have a plan in place to make sure that our diplomats and that our people are protected. And of course, as much as you can to protect the American citizens, in the region. And so that's incredibly important when you're making those kinetic decisions. And then secondly, I think you have to give diplomacy a chance. And I know Steve and Jared Kushner very well, and I think that the two of them really wanted to see if there was any way to get the regime to stop killing their own people. If there is a way to aid the protesters by getting the regime to promise to stop the arrest and the mass slaughter of their people, if there's a way to do it diplomatically, you have to try that first. So I guess for me, when people criticize the president by saying, you said help is on the way and you didn't bomb the next day, for me, there's this is a Southern expression, so I'm sorry to use it, I'm Southern. There's more than one way to skin a cat. I guess it's probably not PC, you can't use that anymore. But what I mean is that it doesn't, when you say help is on the way, that doesn't mean you have to bomb the next day. That means that there's diplomatic, intelligence, economic, and we've done a lot on the economic front that I haven't even talked to, and other coercive measures that you could use to try and aid the Iranian people. And I think that we used all of those options, and then you always use the kinetic one as the last resort. And the Iranian people were extended the hand of diplomacy by the president multiple times, not the Iranian people, excuse me, the Iranian regime. And it's unfortunate that they've chosen time and time again to destroy their own country and their own people for some theocratic revolutionary idea of how they are going to reshape the Middle East.
Yeah, and so just yesterday, during a press conference, Trump floated the idea that a leader from within the regime would be the most ideal future for the leadership of Iran. Mm-hmm. But given that the nuclear program, as well as crackdowns on innocent civilians, has been deeply embedded in the regime's survival strategy for decades, is that realistic, or is he essentially asking for a transformation that the system itself cannot really produce?
I think the president and the administration, I think they would all say that the next leader of Iran, and whatever the new regime looks like, if that happens, right? I mean, that's, again, the stated goals of the Trump administration are focused on destroying the ballistic missiles, nuclear capabilities, the Navy, and the ability to threaten and harass and kill and injure, God forbid, the United States and our allies and friends in the region. So if there is a new regime, we have always said that it's up to the Iranian people to make those decisions. I mean, I remember, this has been ages ago, I'm trying to remember what year it was. My twin sister, I have an identical twin sister, we were both in Afghanistan in Christmas. It was that trip or maybe a trip before. I can't remember which one. I've been to Afghanistan more times than I could count. And I remember meeting Ashraf Ghani before he became president. And I had dinner with him with Carrie Healy, who I know has been a part of Harvard as well. And I was so impressed with him, British educated. I thought, this guy is perfect. This guy should be the president of Afghanistan. Spoiler alert, he was a disaster and one of the worst leaders for us to work with in the Trump administration, incredibly corrupt. And then, cut and run the minute that the Talibs got close. For me, that was a real lesson learned about the ability of the West to pick and choose leaders. All politics is local, even politics in Gaza, even politics in Iran. And so I don't think that the West imposing leaders in the Middle East, I don't think that's going to work. Can we work closely with the Iranian people to help guide the process? Absolutely. And it's going to have to be someone that the Iranian people feel like they have chosen. It's also not going to be one person, right? I think when you look, you and I were talking earlier about Reza Pahlavi, about the Shah's son, and I say, if he wants to go over and risk his life, the way that his fellow countrymen have over the past few years, more power to him. But I think that the administration is going to be hesitant, at least at this point, to pick winners and losers. Number one, because the regime is still in place. Number two, that wasn't a stated goal of this military intervention. And number three, I do think that there is, hopefully, have been a lot of lessons learned from over 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan about our ability to reshape governments and societies. And I think that that's somewhat limited. And I think both the president and the vice president are very keenly aware of the pitfalls.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the biggest questions that's on many people's minds right now is also pertaining to when and how the war with Iran will end. So given the conflicting statements that we've seen come out over the past week or so, we've been hearing a lot of different things about the timeline. So I'm curious to know what you think about when and under what conditions the administration may claim victory.
You say conflicting statements. I say that the president likes to give himself maximum flexibility on all of his options. And I do. I think he doesn't like to be boxed into a corner. And I think that listen, this is, I was saying this to Ned earlier. The Iraq war was deeply a scarring issue within the Republican Party, and the majority of the Republican Party is against it. Against it now, and it was a cause of deep division within America, but even within the Republican Party. And so I don't foresee, and again, I'm not speaking on behalf of Trump or Rubio or Pete Hegseth, but I don't see this being a months-long or even a year-long conflict. I don't think the president is designed that way. I think he has sort of intimated, or maybe he's even outright said, that he's sort of looking for that Delcy Rodriguez type figure that he can work with, and within Iran. There's a lot of talk about who got killed earlier in the strikes. Listen, we know that there's still a lot of people in the prisons that have unfortunately been imprisoned from the regime for speaking out. I think it was a real tragedy that the Green Revolution got stomped out early in the Obama administration, because it was much more organized resistance than unfortunately we've been able to see since that Green Revolution. So I say that to say that I think the president wants to have total, and this is not just with Iran. You could see this on whether he's negotiating with China or what he's doing in Venezuela or anywhere, Russia, Ukraine. He wants maximum flexibility. He doesn't want to be tied into a corner. And we've never seen him committed to prolonged conflicts. And I can't imagine that's something that he's going to pursue this time. So how does it all end is the million-dollar question. And I'm not a fortune teller, but so I don't know how it's all going to end. But I think it will end when President Trump decides it's going to end.
Said like a true spokesperson.
Yeah. It's hard to get rid of it now.
No, but I hear you. Let's shift gears and go back to an earlier challenge during your tenure in the second Trump administration. As our student said, you started as Steve Witkoff's deputy on day one of the second Trump administration. Talk to us a little bit about that experience, about working for and with Steve Witkoff, and talk to us about some of the criticism we've heard that he's essentially the special envoy for everything. It is Russia, Ukraine, it is Gaza, it is Iran, it may be other challenges that are not front and center. Is that a sustainable model of diplomacy?
It's interesting because every administration has different styles for how they operate, and you have to adapt to the policymaker. You have to adapt to the president. From my observation from the Obama and Biden administrations, there was a process. There was a very large NSC, very large White House, and things would start. At the lower level, you'd have a sub PCC, and then you'd have a PCC, and then you'd have a DC, and then you go all the way up to a principals committee. We tried to do that in the Trump administration, and I think that lasted like 2 months, trying to have that process, because that's just not how President Trump works. So, we would look at the Biden or Obama administration and say, that's analysis paralysis, that's way too much debate, that takes way too long. They would probably look at us and say, you guys are way too trigger happy. You make decisions with a few people in the room, and that's true. That is how we make decisions, and Rubio, as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, has reshaped and as a much, much smaller, I think he would argue more agile NSC, in order to be able to staff a president who likes to make very quick decisions and likes to have that maximum flexibility that he talked about. So what was the second part of the question? Remind me again.
Steve Witkoff being the special envoy for everything.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Steve, of course. So how does all of that relate to Steve? Steve is an interesting character. He cracks me up because he is like mini Trump. He's so much like him. He's not ideological at all. I don't know if he was, I know that he was a Trump voter. I do not know if he was a Republican or a Democrat. He spent a lot of his time in New York City. He could have been a Democrat. I don't know. But never struck me as an ideological guy at all. His whole existence and the reason that he took the job was to help his friend be president, and to work. He'd worked with the president in the private sector for decades in New York as one of his lawyers. So when you look at Steve, you're looking at someone who is not going into these negotiations from an ideological perspective that I am trying to push the president into exposition. He went from, this is my friend, I want to get a win for the president, and I'm going to analyze and look at the situation in the way in which that I think is best for the president and best for the American people. The president, and from my observation, likes to make decisions with a few people in the room. He doesn't like an onerous process. He doesn't, like something that's coming from the bottom up that's taking a long time. So I certainly understand that it seems like that Steve is stretched across multiple portfolios, and it's true he is, but I don't think his job is to be in the weeds on every single portfolio. I think he spends a lot of time with his intelligence briefers, a lot of time with people who are working that portfolio on a day-to-day basis. And then what Steve and Jared and others will do is come in and look at it at a very high level and say, what is the best thing in this particular negotiation for the president? What are we getting for the American people? And I don't think either one of them would argue that they have become deep subject matter expertise across all of these portfolios. And you do have negotiators on the ground that are working on these various portfolios day in and day out. But rather, it's a totally different approach for sure. But I think the ability for the president to have his friend and to have people also like Secretary Rubio, who's also deeply involved, to parachute in to these negotiations and look at what's best for the president. That matters because when you're getting to the final decisions of a negotiation and you're saying, should we go X or Y, should we go A or B in all of these negotiations, having someone who speaks for the president and is empowered to make real-time decisions in these negotiations is crucial. And when you have people sitting across the table from you who know that that person speaks for the president, who know that that person is empowered to make decisions, I think is a very different approach. It's a very business-focused approach, and I think that it works for this president. It wouldn't work for every president, but it works for this president.
Can I ask just one follow-up question on this? I mean, is it not a problem?
You're being Matt Lee to me today.
Well, we both endured years of Matt Lee's questioning. But is it not a problem that our chief negotiators are not deep subject matter experts? I mean, critics will say that we arrived at the Alaska summit with President Putin because Steve Witkoff went basically alone to meet with Putin and didn't quite understand what Putin was putting on the table. Critics will also say that he and Jared Kushner went to Oman, didn't quite understand what the Iranians were putting on the table, and we may have missed an opportunity for diplomacy. How do you respond to that criticism? I
think that what matters is the result. And I think a week before President Trump was inaugurated, and credit to the Biden team for allowing Steve and President Trump to be a part of the negotiations on Gaza. We got the first ceasefire in Gaza. That was a week before President Trump was inaugurated. And then, of course, last September, October, was it September or October, we got the second, the major ceasefire, obviously the end of hostilities in Gaza. We were able to get a historic vote at the United Nations, also giving the UN Security Council gave the authority to the Board of Peace and to the governance of Gaza that you're seeing today. That was deeply involved with Mike Waltz, our ambassador, on getting that vote through. Very, very hard-fought vote at the Security Council. So I would argue what matters is results, and I think especially as it relates to those two major ceasefires, years. Steve has been very successful. On the Iran front, I don't know that the criticism of the Oman meeting is fair in that, and I hate to criticize friends, but I think the Omanis were not great interlocutors. They weren't the best mediators. I think things get lost in translation with them. It's why their foreign minister, was on television recording an interview hours before we were getting ready to take kinetic action. I think that there's better. I think that there's better negotiators, and that's why you saw Steve and Jared move, from having talks with the Omanis. Things definitely got lost in translation there, but it didn't have to be that way. One of the reasons, not to put too much blame on the Omanis, but I think, again, in my observation, one of the reasons things got lost in translation is because the Iranians kept refusing direct talks for months. So I think if you look over the past year plus of the Trump administration, Steve has met with the Iranians probably a dozen times. We'd have to count. So I think that the Trump administration fully extended the hand of diplomacy, came prepared, came to negotiations seriously ready to make a deal. What the regime wanted to do is what they have done for decades to Republican and Democratic administrations, both, which is to give enough in order to get the next meeting and get the next meeting and the next meeting and always kick the can down the road and to keep us in negotiations. And they just miscalculated now twice with President Trump in that they thought that strategy would continue to work.
Yeah, and over the past several years, we've heard President Trump speak a lot to this policy of America First. And I'm curious to know, when it comes to foreign policy specifically, how does that play out in practice? And specifically, what did it mean to you during your time under the administration?
That's a great question. Let me try to answer that by giving an example. I think Syria is a great example of what does it mean to be America First, and how does that play out into our foreign policy. So the very first meeting of the National Security Cabinet was on Syria, and that was, we in the Trump administration, came in. We were, after the president was inaugurated, Shara had been successful. Obviously, Assad fled to Russia. And the whole world, not just the United States, we're all, it was quite unexpected, and we're all trying to figure out what is our Syria policy. And that was actually our first discussion in the first meeting, and at that, credit to the president's top advisors. In that meeting, there was a very robust debate about what does it mean to have America First in our Syria policy. Now, at the time, Secretary Rubio was really leading that robust discussion, and I thought his guidance, coming out of that meeting was very wise, was just we need to take a measured and nuanced approach because we don't know this guy. And in fact, what we know of him was in American prisons. And so what you've seen is while the president has decided to meet with him and to take a cautious approach, then he went all in and gave him a meeting at the White House. We did relieve sanctions on the Syrian regime, all the ones that you could mostly relieve from an administration perspective, but Congress still has the ability to snap back sanctions, and we still have sanctions at the United Nations on Syria. Now, when we look at it, the president had to make a very tough decision about, is it in America's interest to keep troops there at a country that's been at civil war for 15 years? And the president's made the decision that it's time to start bringing those American men and women home that have been based there. So I think, it's easy. There's so many problems around the world. And we as Americans get really emotionally involved in some of these conflicts. And we all got really emotionally involved in Syria. But when we were making decisions, we looked at this about, do we support Shara? Do we not support Shara? Do we take a cautious step-by-step approach? Do we jump in the deep end with Shara? And we didn't ultimately, it took until May before the president met with Shara. We didn't do that in January. And what we ultimately decided, in that meeting is that our American interest in Syria were to keep ISIS down, to make sure that ISIS, remember President Trump, and the beginning of his first term worked very hard to unleash the military to destroy the physical caliphate of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And so we had a vested interest in making sure that ISIS did not become resurgent in Syria in a way that it could attack America and plot against the homeland. And second, we had an interest in making sure that Iran couldn't be resurgent in Syria either. So we looked at that first national security meeting and said, every decision that we make on Syria, you could say, do the fate of minorities in Syria matter? Absolutely. We care about the Christians and the Druze and the Alawis. And you could go through, do we care about whether Russia gets basing there? Absolutely. But ultimately, and as all of you that are in college, I was in your position in 2003, I was in college, and we were debating the run-up to the Iraq War. And so before you know it, I promised to all the undergrads who are in here watching, 20, 25 years later, you'll be sitting in this chair, remembering the moment when you were in college at Harvard, debating the Iran war, and you'll be remembering those lessons learned here from your undergrad. So trust me, it happens much quicker than you think. But I think these debates, I think these moments are so important because it is. It's not easy to define American interest, especially in a place like Syria. And it's really easy to fall in love with your file. So you have to be able to constantly pull yourself out and say, with limited munitions, limited defensive capabilities, even though we're a superpower, but limited, we still have a great American ability to project force. But it's difficult when you're doing so by trying to help the Ukrainians, by trying to help the Taiwanese. Now you're involved in the Middle East. So the truth is that you have to make really hard trade-off decisions. And what I would encourage all of you when you go into public office, if you go into the foreign service, or you go into the military, you go into one of our intelligence agencies, is that the trade-off decisions are real, and you have to very much look and say every single time, I'm not going to fall in love with my file, but I'm going to look at this in the perspective of what's best for the American people. And I would argue in the context of Syria, when we were trying to determine that policy early on, we said, you know what, we're going to have to be singularly focused on if we accept Shara, does this help us keep Iran out, and does this help us keep ISIS down? Because those are the guiding pillars of American diplomacy at that point in time.
We are going to transition to audience questions in just a moment. Just a reminder, we have 4 microphones, 2 on the ground level and 2 in the stairwell, so please feel free to start lining up. One last question from us for you, Morgan. You are someone who is very plugged into Republican political circles.
Yeah.
We have about 2.5 years left in this second Trump administration.
I'm getting this question already.
It seems like talk is already turning to, who is next, who is the heir apparent, and the 2 names that are bandied about most often are Secretary Rubio and Vice President Vance. Obviously, they have, by all accounts, very different visions of America's role in the world, American foreign policy. So who do you think is the rightful heir of the Republican mantle, and what does that say about Republican foreign policy going forward?
Well, nice try. I will answer this by saying, listen, it's going to be up to President Trump if he wants to endorse. He may decide not to. I don't know what he's going to do. In my opinion, as somebody who's been in the Republican Party for a long time and observed it, I think that no matter who is the nominee, I think as long as that man has breath in his body, he controls the Republican Party. And so that will be, that's just, I think, how it's going to be. I think so much loyalty is to him. Saying that, I'm a big fan of primaries. If he wants to endorse, he'll endorse. That's President Trump's decision. I think what will happen on the Democratic side is that you'll see a very robust, probably very nasty primary, one that we haven't seen since 2008, right? Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that that's a good thing for the Democrats in the sense that whomever comes out from their primary will probably be incredibly battle-tested. That person will be hardened. So I think that primaries in our system are a good thing, right? It separates the real politicians. It gives the American people, the members of that particular party, the ability to have choices, to see who can handle the debates under the fire, who can handle the pressure. I mean, it's difficult to be on the campaign trail, right? You're getting zero sleep. You've got these reporters in Iowa and New Hampshire where Republican primaries begin. I mean, these are battle-tested reporters. You're running on 2 hours of sleep. You're probably sick. You've had a million briefings. And I think that going through that primary is so important because, number one, it gives the American people the chance to choose the nominee, and you have a 50-50 chance of winning if you're the nominee, so that's an important choice. But it also, I think, reflects what it will be like for you as president, right? You're going to be running, you're going to run off no sleep, you're going to run off adrenaline, you're going to have to make tough decisions, you're going to have to be in the media all of the time. And so I'm a big fan of primaries, and I think no matter who emerges in 2028, again, totally up to President Trump. He's going to decide, and he doesn't care what I think about whether he endorses or not. But maybe it's just for the love of the game. I hope there's a primary.
We will see. We will see. All right. With that, we will turn to questions. Just a reminder, the hallmarks of a question, please keep it brief. Please state your name and affiliation if you are willing, and please end it in a question mark. We will start right there.
A question mark.
Hello, thank you so much. I really enjoyed listening today. My name's Alfred. I'm a second year at the college from Wales in the UK. You've talked a lot about how the Iranian people deserve better and how there ought to be regime change, but you've also mentioned how important it is that Iran does not develop nuclear capabilities. To me, this sounds like two different goals. What makes you think that the Trump administration's actions are going to be effective at instigating regime change and creating a better country for the people of Iran? Or is the main goal American national security and preventing Iran from developing nuclear capabilities, not necessarily bettering the welfare of the Iranian people?
I think the Trump administration's stated goal is the second, is the latter, on ballistic missiles, on nuclear weapons. And they haven't stated, and the president hasn't stated, that regime change is the goal. Now, that gets talked about in the media. But of course, we have talked for both administrations about being supportive of the Iranian people. But we've always were careful in Trump 1, and I think in this administration as well, to understand that it's up to the Iranian people to decide their future and fate. And credit to them, because they do stand up and they do protest. And there's almost, no place in the world other than North Korea or Afghanistan where you see people that are really tormented and brutalized and oppressed by a government that is so at odds with their people. And it's heartbreaking, to see, women just slaughtered again for the crime of wanting to show their hair. And so I don't think, while the administration has not expressed that regime change is one of its goals, it's focused on the kinetic options that you talked about in the second part of their question. You could still use every tool that America possesses in order to support the Iranian people, for them to make the decision and choice about what their future looks like. And I can only hope and pray for them that this is the moment that Iranians and Persians around the world have been praying for over 50 years, or almost 50 years, 47 years. I guess it takes 47 years to see that happen.
Right up there in the...
Good evening. My name is Iman. I'm an MBA candidate here at HKS, and I'm from Lebanon. Thank you for being here with us.
I think I got your paper. Did you write a paper for me?
Yes.
I haven't read it yet, but I looked.
I hope you do.
I promise I'll read it.
Thank you. My question is regarding, as you may know, that the Lebanese Cabinet of Ministers has issued a decree to disarm Hezbollah earlier the week. Today, the president has expressed his readiness to engage in negotiations directly with Israel, to which the American ambassador to Turkey, in charge of the portfolio, said no. What is your advice to the Lebanese government if we are trying to de-escalate tomorrow? My question is, what is one concrete thing we can do to de-escalate the situation and make it better? Thank you.
You could de-escalate the situation by actually disarming Hezbollah. It's funny that you talk about direct negotiations. I actually hosted the first direct negotiations between Israel and Lebanon in 32 years last fall at the Nakora, an area that you know quite well. And we had several meetings of direct negotiations. And they were, they were productive, and it did not end the way I wanted in terms of, a new deal, but we knew it was very early, very preliminary as well. I would just add that my dear friend, Michelle Issa, who about 3 months ago took over the file from me and became U.S. ambassador to Lebanon, is in charge of the file and is doing an excellent job working closely with Ambassador Huckabee to Israel. And so I feel like I left that file in very capable hands with Ambassador Issa and Ambassador Huckabee. Saying that, the Lebanese government, and I have a huge amount of affinity for them, and I developed a very close working relationship with President Aoun and Nawaf Salam, and even Speaker Berry, who has managed to outfox every politician in Lebanon for decades. This government under the leadership of Nawaf Salam, the cabinet was very good at words. They were very good at declaring things. They have lacked on action, unfortunately. For example, in August, they did something which was very historic for them, which said, we're not going to have any weapons outside of the hands of the state. As you know better than anyone, you're from Lebanon. For decades, Hezbollah has operated as a state within a state, government within a government, had illegal arms against the state, and obviously, since 2006, has dragged Lebanon into 2 different wars that nobody in Lebanon wanted to be involved in and would continue to do so. So under the leadership of the Chad, you know this, but I'll give all of your colleagues, your classmates, history lesson. Under his leadership, we worked, and I was overseeing something called the Mechanism, where the Lebanese government was working to disarm Hezbollah south of the Litani, in what they call the South Litani sector. And while there was some major successes there, and what people didn't see is through the Mechanism, we actually had both sides working together, especially through our American Marines that we had on the ground. There were successes there, but at the same time, it wasn't enough. And what we saw, what Hezbollah was doing, by the way, is not different than any other terrorist organization. When they are degraded, they seek to reconstitute, right? I mean, ISIS tries to do this, Al-Qaeda tries to do this, the Talibs did this, cartels in Mexico will do this. So their behavior wasn't different from any other terrorist organization, but nonetheless, what happened is that the Lebanese government made a half-hearted attempt at trying to disarm. Clearly, it didn't work because a lot of the rockets that have been fired at Israel have been in the South Litani sector, which was supposed to be cleared in phase 1. And so, unfortunately, I think while the government said a lot of words and had a lot of declaration and had every intent, I think, to try and make declarations that the government had never made before, unfortunately, that never translated into the real disarmament of Hezbollah. And I think the reason that it never translated is because they are more concerned about instability within Lebanon than they are about actually disarming Hezbollah. So they did what they've done for decades to Republican and Democratic administrations, which was to do enough to try and keep the Americans, appeased, but not enough to actually rid themselves of the cancer within. So I will say that we're in the position that we're in today, and I warned them all last year it was going to happen. I mean, I had meeting after meeting with them. I said it privately. I said it publicly. I warned them so many times that you will take, by them meeting the government and its leaders, I said, you guys, you are going to end up back into a war with Israel if you don't take this disarmament of Hezbollah seriously. They have to be disarmed. There is the easy way or there's the hard way, right? And maybe that's not fair. It's not easy for the government to do it themselves. But it's unfortunate for me to see the position that Lebanon is in today, and nor do I think that this war between Israel and Lebanon will end anytime soon. The only way that it ends is whenever Hezbollah isn't a threat to the northern citizens of Israel. And if the Chad and if the president, if the prime minister decide to make serious on the commitments that the cabinet voted, that the government made, and actually do disarmament, then you'll see the war end. But short of that period from 2006 to 2023, where Hezbollah was allowed to build their arsenal and to become a serious threat, I don't think you're ever going to see another period where Israel allows decades of armament on their northern border towards their citizens again. So I hope the government's learned their lesson, but it's frustrating. I worked on that file for a year and warned them that this would happen, and the chickens came home to roost.
Right up here.
Hi, yeah, thanks for being here. My name is Zahra. I'm a journalist and a current master's student. This actually takes me back to the State Department briefing room, but at that point I was pressing your successor, Tammy Bruce. My question today is
Where are you from? A journalist from where?
I worked for a Turkish news channel.
Turkish, okay, got it.
Yeah. My question today is, if the stated military goal wasn't regime change in sort of the past few week and a half of military activity, why was Ali Khamenei struck and killed? And in hindsight, do you think that was a tactical error given the mass mobilization that's come about in Iran, but also throughout the Muslim world behind that attack on sovereignty?
The question is, do I think it was a mistake to target the supreme leader in the initial, if the goal wasn't regime change? That's an interesting question. No, I don't think it was a mistake because he was given the opportunity to make deals, and this is a regime that, again, it's not just been the past few weeks, it's been the past few years in which they continually have plotted to kill President Trump and top cabinet officials, and have made these plots both overseas and domestically here in the United States. And so, no, I don't think it was a mistake. I think that your goal can be to go after ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, and your goal can be to focus on the military side, to focus on the Iranian Navy. I don't feel bad for any of these people. I mean, these are people that tortured and mass executed their own people and plotted to kill my president. So we were better at it than you were.
Hi, my name is Avi Eisen. I'm a student here at HKS. Before my question, I'd like to just take a moment of silence for the 7 service members who were killed in the conflict and the tens of thousands of brave Iranian men and women who are doing the best for their freedom. I also, on a lighter note, want to acknowledge that a couple of weeks away is Passover, so happy Passover to your family. My question is regarding the many conflicts we're experiencing in the last 47 years. The idea of mukawama, of resistance, basically says, I don't have to win, I just have to stand after the conflict is over and the dust settles, and by that I actually won. And following up on Iman's great question about Lebanon, how do we get rid of these, as you said, cancerous organizations? How do we make sure that there is a definite, I want to say, moment of victory, as the president is saying repeatedly, and that it's clear and that we have the other side lose its will to rise again?
Yeah, it's that we're, what year is it, 2026, so 23 years past the Iraq War. It's amazing to me. The questions that you're asking are questions that I struggled with. I'm sure you did too, Ned, as an undergrad. And then I struggled with these questions as a grad student at Hopkins. And then I've struggled with these questions. And, I worked in Bush, Obama, Trump won. I'm a reservist, so I was on active duty for a bit in Biden and again in Trump too. I guess I like it. I like being tortured. And so the question that you ask is something that for 23 years of GWAT and 25 years when you go back to 9/11 that we have struggled with. And we've been struggling as a nation. We've been asking ourselves for 25 years, what does victory look like against terrorism? And I think the one thing that we've learned is that you never fully stamp out ideologies, but is there enough of a strategic defeat of your enemy that you have the ability that the enemy, that the terrorist group, whichever one you're focusing on, is no longer a persistent and daily threat to your people. So I think ISIS is a good example in that. In the first term of President Trump, when we worked to destroy the physical caliphate in Syria and Iraq, we destroyed a physical caliphate. ISIS still exists because you're never going to fully stamp out an ideology. But I think as policymakers, as intelligence professionals, as military professionals, what you have to say is, have I degraded that threat to a low enough place that it is not a persistent and daily threat to the people, to my people, to the American people, to wherever you serve, while also acknowledging that these are realities that you're always going to have to deal with. In the case of ISIS, we're always going to have these hotspots around the world. It might move to places like in the Sahel, in Africa, or other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. But the hard choices that you make as policymakers, and we say this in every administration, is how do you focus on our own hemisphere? In the case of Trump 2, in the case of the Biden and even the Trump 1 administration, how do you focus on the threat from the Chinese Communist Party? How do you contain them? So you're always going to have, this is why, as a diplomat, or if you decide to go into the military or in the IC, you're always going to have threats, right? You're never going to have nostalgia, or you're never, going to have world peace. You're never going to have kumbaya. But what you have to do as a policymaker is to decide at what point have you degraded that threat, the capability of your enemy from being able to threaten the American citizens, while knowing that it's never going to be perfect. You're never going to completely stamp these things out. So those are tough choices and decisions, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's been hard for multiple administrations to turn away from the Middle East, because unfortunately we continue to have that persistent threat.
Why don't we try to get 2 final questions in? Maybe we'll group these last 2 questions so we can hear as many as we can. Go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Shreesh. I'm an undergrad here at the college. I want to go back to the first part of the discussion, which was answering different abstractions over the question of what caused the U.S. What was the primary reason for which the U.S. got involved in this? I think there were a few viable reasons that were discussed. The first was the enriched uranium, and so I guess taking as a predicate for the sake of discussion that this exists, this feels less likely to me because of the reasons of, one, previous invasions with B-2 bombs didn't yield the end of pursuit in nuclear enrichment and whatnot. The second being that this tends to exist deep underground, and so they're difficult to actually go and prevent. And the third being that actually extracting enriched uranium has significant volatility for nearby area. And so then the second reason was primarily driven out of human rights concerns. Although unfortunate, I do think there's a minimal prior for the U.S. getting involved in other nations, especially with military use, purely out of human rights concerns.
Sharif, I think we're low on time. Do you have a question?
Sorry, yeah. So the third reason that seems interesting to me is oil, and the U.S. and the dollar being the reserve currency that's used for trading oil in OPEC and whatnot. I guess I'm curious to know, one, why is this not more publicly talked about as a reason, at least from the administration, and B, is this a viable reason?
So hold that thought. We'll take this question and then we'll answer both of them together.
Hi, I'm Mateen, first year at the college. I wanted to push back on your assertion of the hand of diplomacy. In particular, with these recent strikes, the civilian death toll, we're still trying to figure out what that number is. Estimates say it's at least 1,200 now in Iran. And given strikes on multiple schools now, desalination plants, which is a war crime, and several other strikes in civilian territories, and the United States' track record in the Middle East, countries like Iraq, Libya, et cetera, my question is why do you think Iranians should be willing to trust this administration and the United States in this instance?
Okay, so if I understand the first question, you're why are we not talking more about the oil aspect to the war?
Yeah, at least it feels like
I think because we're oil exporters, right? And so I don't think I fully understand. You think it was a motivation for us to attack Iran as it relates to oil in what way?
As in having more control over the Strait of Hormuz. For instance, today they were Navy
yeah.
were helping.
I don't know. Listen, for a year in the administration when we talked about, when it was no one was ever trigger happy in these discussions about whether we would use kinetic force or not. If anything, it was very serious and sober conversations. The first CENTCOM commander, General Kurilla, who just retired last year, when he took us through all of the options and what he thought could be how the Iranians could attack back if we made these decisions. I was in almost every single national security discussion related to this topic, and things related to oil just never came up. If anything, they were very sober, very serious. We were always concerned about the threats to our military personnel into the region, to our diplomats, to American citizens, and of course to our allies and friends. But there was never a conversation of should we attack Iran, based off trying to control their oil supply. That wasn't, if anything, the conversations were focused on, is there any realistic way that we can get these people to a yes? And by the way, we put really good proposals on the table for the Iranians. I mean, one of the proposals that Steve came up with after the 12-day war was about a regional consortium of enrichment, which the Emiratis are basically in the 1-2-3 agreement. If you really want peaceful nuclear power, there's no reason to turn that down. I mean, we really gave them, if you really genuinely only cared about peaceful nuclear power, about medical research that you could use coming off the nuclear field, if that's what you cared about, you would have taken our agreement. But again, I would argue that this is a theocratic revolutionary regime. If they had a nuclear weapon, they would use it, just as they have used everything in their arsenal and worked to upend and fund their proxies and torture the entire Middle East. And I think, we can debate and agree and disagree and say, no, they only wanted the weapon to just scare or intimidate their neighbors and friends. I fundamentally believe that if Iran were able to obtain the nuclear weapon, they would use it. And so then the question becomes, how do you prevent them from doing so? Do you do it through diplomacy? Do you do it through kinetic action? And I would argue that we had a dozen instances where we tried to get them to a deal, and we offered them very, very good proposals that if you were a country that was serious about protecting your people, if you were a country that was serious that you only wanted peaceful civilian nuclear technology, you would have taken one of those deals, and they just chose not to. I think the other question was related to strikes. I mean, that could have hit. I don't think the administration has confirmed one way or the other about the girls' school that you talked about. I think what the administration has said is that they're doing an investigation. I will tell you, I used to be in the military. I was a Navy Reserve officer, and I was in a targeting unit out in Nevada for a while. I'll tell you, somebody who's been in the military, targeting is a very, very technical skill. It's a very hard skill to learn. Our targeters go through tons and tons of training in schools. It's one of the hardest proficiencies to get into the military because of how technical it is. Unfortunately, in the 25 years of GWOT, we could go through tons and tons of times where the U.S. has misfired. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy when that happens. I remember in Afghanistan, after we had the bombing, of course, in Kabul that killed all of our Marines and Navy, and the Biden administration sought to retribution for that. We accidentally killed a family. I remember in the Obama administration, I believe there was a wedding party in Yemen that we struck. You could give examples from Republican and Democratic administrations. It's not particular to one thing. It means that in the fog of war, sadly and tragically, miscalculations happen. I think this administration will do a full investigation. But what really is unnerving is when you see that the regime is willing to put a girls' school next to an IRGC base. I don't know why you would do that. There's no excuse for that. And I think that there is a very big difference between the respect for our citizens and for the citizens of the world. I can tell you that whenever the U.S. military, and this is true for this administration and the prior administrations that I've been involved in, it's not related to one particular party. If there is an investigation and if the U.S. is involved in a strike that is tragic, whether it's the family in Afghanistan that was innocent or the wedding party in Yemen, whatever it may be, those things are taken incredibly seriously. And in America, we have military accountability, we have military justice. These things, unfortunately, doesn't happen in the rest of the world, but I can speak for our military system that we take this stuff quite seriously.
Well, I want to thank both of these extraordinary women for being on stage with me. Bahar, thank you for being my partner up here today. And of course, and your fan club in the stands. Morgan, most importantly, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your perspective. I think we all benefit enormously from it. And hopefully you can leave here and tell your friends in the Trump administration that Harvard is not so bad. Thank you all.
Thanks.